Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session of Justice in Action. My name is Tess, and I'm with the Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. If this is your first time joining us, Justice in Action is a weekly conversation series featuring Ruth Messenger, the JCC social justice activist in residence, and Brad Lander, New York City Council member. Each week we meet to discuss a different social justice issue and the way that COVID-19 is exacerbating it. I'd like to give a special thanks to our new co-sponsors of the series, Avodah, B'nai Jeshurun, Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, the JTS Henzell Center for Ethics and Justice, the National Council of Jewish Women New York, Repair the World Brooklyn, and Repair the World Harlem. So we are very grateful for you guys. If you joined us last week, you know that we covered educational inequities last week as well. But given how critical and widespread this issue is, we felt it was important to do an additional session as well. Today, we're joined by Mark Winston Griffith, producer and co-host of School Colors, a podcast about race, class, and about how race, class, and power impact and shape American cities and schools, and the executive director of the Brooklyn Movement Center, a Black-led community-based organization working to build power and self-determination in Bedside and Crown Heights, as well as Emma Rehac, the youth director at IntegrateNYC, a youth-led org that advocates for integration equity in New York City schools. And Emma, I think are you the founder of a student transit organization?
Yeah, I'm the founder and lead organizer, hence the Metro cards, of a coalition for student transit justice.
Very cool. So we're really grateful to have them here. And one quick note, while we're committed to hosting this conversation series, the views and opinions expressed by our panelists do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the co-hosts or the JCC. Feel free to chat us with any questions at any point in time in the chat or the Q&A box on your screen. Any point the questions come up, please feel free to put them in there and we'll try and get to them as best we can. And one quick note, next week, as you guys know, this has been a weekly conversation series every Thursday. Next week, it's a little bit different. Ruth and Brad are going to be speaking together about electoral politics and the Jewish obligation to advocacy at a special JCC event called Tikkun. It happens from 9 p.m., I think, 10 p.m. until 4 a.m. Next Thursday. It's pretty crazy, and they're going to be speaking at, I believe, a 10 o'clock slot, which I know is late, but it's a very special occasion, and you'll get an email with all the details about it, but just so you know, it's going to be a little different next week. And off to you, Brad.
Now to me. Yes. So thanks, Tess. Lots of information, guys, but you'll get all that information. As Tess said correctly, we are dealing with areas, thematic areas, issue areas in the city of New York that we see as being particularly impacted by the pandemic, but obviously these are areas that have had troubles from the beginning, and we hope that our guests will always talk to that. She said we were doing education again because it's such a big issue, but let's be clear, we could have a week-long discussion on the state of education in New York and the various and powerful community-based organizations and student organizations that are trying to address some of the inequities. So it's good that we're doing it 2 weeks in a row. It was great that last week we had Carrie Lazar-White and Jose Vilfan from Carrie from Brotherhood Sister Soul in Harlem, and Jose as a math teacher in Washington Heights for 15 years, the author of a book or two, each of them talking from their point of view, both about the ongoing and existing inequities and about the particular problems right now in their cases, not necessarily in today's cases, but in their cases, if you recall, students who, among other things, have no access, fill in the blank, no access to sufficient food in their homes, no access to the laptops on which they're supposed to be studying, no access to the web on which their laptops are supposed to be connected, all kinds of additional problems. But it is certainly our contention that these problems are a new manifestation of problems that have been there for a long time. So I'm going to turn it over to Brad to start engaging in conversation with both Emma and Mark. I will come in and out at various points in time, but let me just be clear that in my life as the parent of 3 children who graduated from the New York City Public Schools, as a one-time, a million years ago, school board member, and as somebody who was in elected office for 20 years trying to address the problems in the school system, I'm really clear how severe those problems are, how much they widen the gaps among students on the basis of both class and race, and therefore how much there is to do. Brad, a current parent in the New York City schools and a current elected official.
Thank you, Ruth. We have 2 like really incredible guests today, so I'm grateful to be able to introduce all of you to them. And last week I learned so much from Kari and Jose, and we dug in pretty deep on the both inequities and segregation in the school system. We talked a little last week about that tension, and we will again today, because Kari in particular from Brotherhood Sister Soul was speaking to both the powerful harms of segregation, but also the desire to be able to build schools out of the Black experience that really lift up and empower the young people there. And we're going to continue that conversation today with 2 people, different generations maybe, but with powerful insights into these issues, and 2 people that I've had the really good fortune to work with. And I'll briefly sort of say, so I have, my kids are 20 and 16 and grew up in New York City public schools. And I'm ashamed to say that even though I was thinking about segregation in housing policy and working on a lot of racial justice issues in the criminal justice system, that for honestly most of their time in the New York City public school system, I was not really seeing just what a powerfully segregated system it is. Both my kids went to an overwhelmingly white public school right here in Park Slope, really dynamite school that gave them a great education. And, we just did it without really thinking. That's like our neighborhood school. And then all the kids from that school want to go to middle school 51, not far down the street. And even though that's one of 11 middle schools in District 15, and District 15, because it includes Red Hook and Sunset Park, as well as Park Slope, is diverse in many of the ways New York City is. That's where all their friends wanted to go. That's where they went, and didn't give that too much thought either. And it was really about 5 years ago, on about Monday was the 66th anniversary of Brown versus Board. Last year on its 65th anniversary, IntegrateNYC had a whole retire segregation party, trying to arrange like a forced retirement of segregation, which sadly it did not retire. But about 5 or 6 years ago, a little bit of a movement picked up to say, whoa, 60 years after Brown versus Board, New York City's schools are really not appreciably less segregated than they were, and amongst the most segregated in the country. And all you folks like me who move your kids through this system as though that's just the way it is, are participating in the perpetuation of inequity through a public institution that you expect to deliver you like an education of like private school quality for your white kids, without seeing like what that whole system is. And as a result of a lot of good organizing and pushing, I was able to start to be part of a movement led by people of color, including students, demanding change to the system. And over the last 5 years, while we've only made a little bit of progress, I think at least the conversation that 5 years ago had really sort of shut down is at least opened up. And I think a lot of people who were not seeing, kind of have blinders on, have been forced to see the issue in some different ways. And obviously now in the COVID crisis, all the more, because one consequence of segregation, amongst others, is that students in poverty are disproportionately in a small number of schools. That's true for homeless kids, it's true for low-income kids, and so of course at a moment when the system is supposed to like switch to remote, those folks who have broadband access, who have access to technology, who have parents who are more able to kind of show up as, second educators, all those things, like we segregate where those folks are. And that is showing up right now in the COVID system as well in really devastating ways. So we wanted to have this conversation, and I thought, okay, what two people would I like to talk to the audience about how we got here, what it has been looking like before the COVID crisis, and what do we got to find ways to do out of it. Mark and Emma were the two people that I was really excited to bring to you. So I'm going to introduce Mark first because, you know, I know Mark and I have worked together in different ways across 25 years. He's got a history as an economic justice advocate, helping build the Central Brooklyn Federal Credit Union, doing a lot of amazing public policy work at places including the Drum Major Institute. And then over the last few years, founding the Brooklyn Movement Center as a Black-led organizing hub in Central Brooklyn on a range of issues: food equity and access, educational injustice, and the criminal justice system as well. And they've done a lot of really powerful education organizing work in District 16. But Mark most recently did this amazing School Colors podcast, which I really would encourage people to listen to all the episodes. It's a hard listen because it takes you back to the Ocean Hill-Brownsville fight. And, you know, I think a lot of folks in this call come up out of a Jewish social justice tradition and might have heard from Jewish teachers about what that was about and not necessarily sat with the Black experience of that struggle. And definitely not necessarily understanding how it yielded us so much of this system we have today, both highly segregated, but also so deeply inequitable. And even in its segregation, like you might imagine a segregated system that at least said in Black and brown communities, we will think about what it would mean to have empowering schools that had teachers enabled to work with students to build from their communities and their traditions. And even that, as Mark's podcast really shows, is not close to what we have delivered. So Mark, I know it's not fair to ask you to sort of reprise in a couple of minutes what is a podcast everybody should listen to, but tell us why you decided to do it, and, you know, what for you the main takeaways of it were. Obviously all pre-COVID, and then we'll come back a little later to what it means now. You got to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you, Brad, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. You know, I usually start my conversations when I'm on with Brad, gushing about him and his leadership over the years, and just what a distinct privilege it's been for me to be able to work with someone who's an elected official and has just a level of integrity that you just don't see very often. So thank you again for including me in this. To answer your question very specifically, School Colors is an 8-part documentary podcast that really looks at race, class, and power in American schools through the prism of a particular school district and neighborhood. I approach it as not only as a journalist, but as someone who's been working on social justice issues all my adult life, and as a parent and someone who has made Central Brooklyn their home over several generations, whose grandparents go back to have lived in this neighborhood. And so I am a co-host along with Max Friedman, who identifies as who's white, who is Jewish, and who identifies as a gentrifier and a newcomer to Central Brooklyn. And we really look at the history. I would say 4 of the episodes within School Colors take a historical view of Central Brooklyn, and schooling in Central Brooklyn go back to Weeksville, and really look at how, we frame this oftentimes in terms of integration and segregation. We're really just talking, it's really a conversation about inequity, not just in concrete educational terms, but in social, political, and economic terms, and how that is very much interwoven into the school system. And so we take a look at that over the years, and look at the attempts for self-determination that parents and families really, this war that they wage on inequity, through this lens of self-determination, and then look at where we are today over the next 4 episodes, and look at certain touch points, like, for instance, charter schools, and look at the closing of public schools here in District 16, and I talk about how, as a person who now lives a middle-class life, what it is like as a Black parent to make certain choices, and what those implications are for me as a parent, for my children, and the sort of the middle-class privilege that is competing with still being a Black person in society. And then we end off really looking at gentrification and how what the role that plays in extending inequity. So hoping everyone will get a chance to listen to that and to explore that and to really see themselves in that. The way we approach it, we think that anyone listening to it, whether you're a parent or not, whether you're a student, no matter, whether you live in New York or not, I think you'll be able to hear your own experience in that.
I can really vouch for that, and I do urge people that we send an email out to everyone that comes on. We'll send a link, and I want to ask you to talk for 1 minute more about the Ocean Hill-Brownsville tensions, just because I think for a liberal Jewish, not everyone in this of the participants are liberal Jews from the Upper West Side, but disproportionately so. And it was painful to listen to that. I mean, what I had not understood was just how powerful and organic this movement for self-determination was. A set of people who had received a segregated school system, but what they tried to do with it was turn it into a powerful space of Black-led self-determination, and that the large, not entirely Jewish obviously, but Jewish-led and largely Jewish teachers union was very threatened by that, and deployed its political power to kill it. And I know you're a strong union advocate. You come from a union family. You and Max do the podcast together. You've got a deep set of ties, but I think you help reckon with that. It's ignoring that past and pretending it away is not going to help us build a kind of solidarity and a fight for justice in a still very segregated city and system. So I want to appreciate that you did it in a way that helped lift it up honestly, but with compassion. And I know I've heard you talk about how painful that was, but I just wonder if you can.
Right. So yeah, we spend 2 of the episodes 2 and 3, diving into Ocean Hill-Brownsville for a couple of reasons. One, because it's really hard to look at the system we have now without seeing a lot of the seeds of the divisions and the problems and the issues that are raised, seeing them in Ocean Hill-Brownsville. Then inevitably, so many things structurally kind of lead from Ocean Hill-Brownsville. But another goal of ours was to really take this incident that was throughout 1968 and 69, that has been painted in a very one-dimensional way, or at least our understanding of it, I think, is one-dimensional. That is, that this was a fight of, Black people versus white Jewish people, and this fight of what was being called Black anti-Semitism. And what we do is go back and see how it's so much more complex than that it really did come down to self-determination. And as Brad said, yes, I have a deep history in the labor world and labor movement, particularly with the UFT. My father, my uncle, aunts and uncles, they were all very much a part of the UFT. And we understand that the UFT was fighting for its own self-determination, right? They saw themselves threatened because they knew that if decisions were being made locally about teachers, that would affect what they do as a union. And so we saw that was pitted against what parents were trying to do, really as a way of survival. People think of education in its own little sort of bubble, but particularly for Black parents, for people who feel disenfranchised, education is really the main way in which their families can break free of the constraints they felt over generations. And so we put that into stark relief and really just kind of tease out all of the issues that came up and how these struggles were personal, they were political, they were ideological. And at the end of the day, the people, I think we all lost in many ways. I think the Black-Jewish relations as we saw them politically lost. I think the labor movement lost a lot of credibility. and ultimately the educational futures of a lot of people, not just in Central Brooklyn, but across the country, that was damaged as well.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to you on sort of District 16 currently and some of the current challenges, but I want to bring Emma.
Before you go to Emma, I want to add one interesting historical note. Mark, let's not spend any time on this, but when Ocean Hill-Brownsville was identified, before the furor that you described so well, but when it was identified as the possible site for a kind of an experimental effort to improve schools, that came out of a report from the Ford Foundation.
Right.
And the Ford Foundation identified Ocean Hill-Brownsville, IS 201 in Harlem, and a third site, which I don't remember right now, but the critical issue is in the first draft of the Ford Foundation recommendations, one of the sites that they proposed was the area around Joan of Arc Junior High School on the west side. And we believe, and we have believed for our entire lifetimes, that the commitment of this community to make it work is why they didn't designate us.
Wow. Yeah, and like you said, we focus on Ocean Hill-Brownsville, but this experiment was being held in other places around the city as well.
But they were chosen. I mean, you know, you could just let you go in a minute, Brad, but you could understand the attraction of those sites because they were challenging sites, but they were also sites that were ripe for the kind of tension and then the kind of conflict that built up, particularly in Brooklyn. And on the west side, I'm not saying there wouldn't have been tension, but there was a large, it's not unlike District 15 today, so there was a large number of white middle-class parents still in the schools who had actually improved some of the schools, the elementary schools, and I think we could have made it work, and they took it away at the very last minute and never designated us.
And I think Mark's final point, I just want to like underline as we transition and hear from kind of Emma about the student organizing and the situation now. But, you know, there is some tension, obviously, we'll come back to this, between, you know, an approach that really leans into integration and would follow Brown and would say, let's actually distribute all our students across all our schools and then commit together to delivering them equal and integrated education, and a more like community empowerment and self-determination approach. But over the time since Ocean Hill-Brownsville, we took neither of those approaches, right? Like you might have leaned in, New York City could have leaned into a community control and self-determination and empowerment approach. It could have leaned into an integration approach. We did neither of those things. We essentially said, this just seems like it's a powder keg. So let's just live with a segregated city. We'll emphasize some good options so we don't lose all the white middle class parents from the system. We'll build a system that has places they can go and feel like they're getting, you know, what they want. And we'll let the system fail tons of other kids. We'll stop trying to enforce integration, and we won't move forward with these kind of community control or self-empowerment models. You know, and then you have Bloomberg come in with this sort of charter schools, you know, choice, meritocracy, kind of market-based approach. But all that really did was sort of paper over the existing system with some new language. It neither challenged its segregation nor its inequities. And now here we are, you know, and it's so challenging that even a mayor like, you know, that it wasn't that, you know, both that Bill de Blasio comes in on a narrative of Tale of Two Cities and fairness, but mostly hoped to avoid this set of issues. You know, he hoped if he could do pre-K and do affordable housing and dump some additional programs into the schools and still not really reckon. But it has proved hard for him to not reckon at all, because a set of activists have gotten loud. And luckily we have one of them here. So, and it's been a broad movement that's not only students, but the student leaders of the current integration movement in two organizations in particular, Teens Take Charge and IntegrateNYC, have just been extraordinary, not only because they're fearless and get in the mayor's face and the chancellor's face and are, you know, and are so clear in their commitment to equality and each other. But one thing that I have been really powerfully struck by is just how much they demonstrate both the moral power of the idea and how clearly true it is that when you give people some power and treat them as equal, then they show up, because the kind of activism that IntegrateNYC does, you're just like, I guess actually people like really are equal and really have powerful leadership. and take serious voice. And I have said a lot of times that I really think the young people of IntegrateNYC are the most hopeful thing happening in New York City today. And I really mean it. And so Emma, it's great to have you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know your personal story is a powerful one, and how you got into activism generally. If you want to take a detour through the Metro cards in your background before you get to IntegrateNYC, that's great. But then talk about the school integration movement and its student leaders today.
Totally, thank you. So my name is Emma. I am currently a high school senior. So this is kind of an odd ending to high school, like my last day of high school. I did not know it was the last day of high school. And I live in Central Harlem. And so as an infant, I was essentially abandoned in a train station in China, and I was sent to an orphanage, and I lived in an orphanage for about a year as a baby, where they would distribute vaccines without clean needles, where I got hepatitis C. And then my parents adopted me a little after my first birthday, and I moved to New York. And my parents split up when I was at a pretty young age, and so I've been raised by a white woman who is also a working class educator, immigrant. And so now I'm living as an Asian girl in Central Harlem by a white single mom. And so there's all of these intersections in my life, which I think made me very socially aware from a really young age. And that kind of intersectional perspective I bring to my organizing and advocacy, where I'm involved in student transit justice and housing justice and education equity and all of these different issues. But I think that they all intersect in similar ways, and the roots of so many of these different social injustices are the same. So I think that I definitely try to carry a lot of my experiences and personal background with me to the work that I do. And I think that my experiences are the reason why I do the work that I do. And so when I was 14 years old, I entered spaces of organizing, first on like electoral campaigns, and then I worked at a restorative justice program called the Harlem Youth Court, where young people who were convicted of low-level to medium-level crimes would come to us and get their records expunged upon the completion of our programming. And so I did that for 2 years, my first 2 years of high school, or my second 2 years of high school. And then from there, and my involvement in electoral organizing and campaigning, I became more involved in issue campaigns and more policy focused. And so now I've been working at IntegrateNYC for about a year. And I think that, Brad, what you kind of highlighted about, you know, there's these two ideals of integration that's, you know, full radicalized like policy integration or more community empowerment. And I think that something that IntegrateNYC really tries to uplift is kind of like real integration can't occur without community empowerment. And so also what I think you guys have touched on is how if we want to be seeing kind of authentic progress in any of these issues, whether it be education or housing or transportation, there needs to be some sort of transfer of power, where for so long, all of these issues have not, or solutions have not worked. All of this money has been pumped into education reform, but nothing has happened because those with authority have kept their power, and the communities that have been marginalized remain that way. And so the only way to really get true integration or true reform is when the people directly impacted are the ones who have the power. So whether it be students, parents, educators, those are the people whose voices need to be centered in the policy making. So I think that that kind of idea is applied to education, but can be applied to any other issue as well. And especially now, we see so many intersections between different social issues, especially for students. You know, our living conditions, our working conditions, our learning conditions, our testing conditions. I have a virtual AP test in a few hours, which I'll be doing in the same seat with the same computer, you know? So I definitely think that, you know, my intersectional background can be so applied to all of these other spaces of organizing and issues that are very intersectional and can't really be discussed in like isolation.
I want to ask a little more about what you're seeing in your networks and communities in the school system now. But before I do that, just because I know that Integrate in particular works so hard to drill down on what you're just talking about, these sort of making integration. I think it's easy for people to think of integration as, you know, either like just kind of moving bodies around,
Yeah.
you know, and dangerously also as a, like, you know, it can be heard to be thinking that Black and brown students can only succeed like if there are white kids nearby, as opposed to an understanding that we have not been able to deliver anything like equity and educational opportunities so long as it is segregated, and that, you know, that's the idea behind Brown. But Integrate has really dug down on these 5 R's of kind of real integration, and you alluded to them, but I wonder if you just want to, you know, tease that out a little bit more.
Yeah, totally. So we've created a platform for what we call real integration, created by and for students. And the Department of Education has actually taken them on as their pillars of how to make a more integrated school system. So we have 5 R's: representation, relationships, restorative justice, race and enrollment, and resources. And those 5 R's, we see that schools that are well resourced or majority white or have very exclusionary screens have some of those R's but lack others, while other schools that might be more predominantly students of color or lesser resourced, again, have some of those R's but not others. And so a lot of schools that are really well resourced lack diversity in their race and enrollment, and lack those kind of really supportive student teacher and student faculty relationships and school community that we might see in schools with more marginalized students that don't have the same resources. And so we're saying that in a truly integrated school, all 5 of those R's exist. And, you know, I think that that kind of balance, again, like you said, where there's this notion that students of color need to have white students there or students with wealth in order to succeed, it goes the same way, flipped, where white students or students with wealth or students with privilege need other students in order to succeed as well. Where, you know, I think that in so many discussions around diversity, we kind of forget what the actual value in diversity is, where, you know, we define our students by their GPAs and our test scores, and schools by their demographic statistics, but diversity isn't an advertisement ploy, right? It's there because you're getting a diverse amount of perspectives, which, especially in an educational space, I think is the most valuable thing to have. And so whether the school be predominantly Black or predominantly white, if it's lacking that kind of diversity, then you're lacking the center of what diversity is supposed to mean, right? And that also comes diversity of all forms, which we also highlight in our campaign to end exclusionary screens, because diversity can't just be racial, but it also has to be diversity in gender, diversity in class, diversity in where you're from, diversity in experience. You know, I go to a predominantly white District 2 school. I'm a out-of-district student of color. How I got in, I don't really know. It's like kind of like an anomaly where the algorithm shouldn't have worked. But at my school, we'll have discussions for an entire month about Black History Month without any Black students present in the classroom, right? And it's like, how can we be truly learning about these issues and having these discussions when the experiences of the faculty and of the students don't reflect that of what we're supposed to be talking about, right? And so we have this predominantly white faculty that tries to teach us things about experiences of marginalized people that they've never experienced and that they don't know. You know, and I think that in education, it's not about, you know, just the curriculum, which also needs reform, but the experiences that exist in the classroom, I think, is the most valuable part. And really is the reason why we need to diversify and integrate our schools, not to make the statistics look pretty, you know?
Well said. So give us a little sense of what it's like now. You know, that's all that set of things you set up are, you know, were true 3 months ago. And, you know, and as with so many other things, the COVID crisis shines a spotlight on all these pre-existing inequalities, and then just like both makes them worse. So give us a little sense from kind of within your networks and your communities, kind of what the experience of and the, you know, the diverse experiences of remote learning are, and, you know, some of the challenges. I know the mayor just announced yesterday how many kids are being recommended for summer school, and, you know, just all the challenges that continue. So there's a little sense of, and Mark, do you want to start?
Sorry, I thought you were asking Emma, so I was like, I was listening to the question. So I'm sorry. So could you just say it one more time? I mean, I was listening, but I wasn't listening with the idea of
All right. I was just asking, I mean, I know obviously you've got your own experience as a parent, but then you're also through the Brooklyn Movement Center in touch with a lot of other school families and school communities and parents. And I just wonder if you could give a sense of like, what's the breadth, you know, are you seeing some places where remote learning is working? You know, what is and what is not working kind of in the remote learning in your...
What are the impacts of the virus on kids and on families, and what are the impacts of the uncertainties about summer school and about the fall?
Right. Well, you know, I think that what's happening is, you know, and I come to this really as not just someone who's observing what's going on in schools, but as a parent and someone who's getting caught up in all of this. And what I see is a severe sense of disempowerment from parents, really not having a lot of information, not feeling like the DOE is very forthcoming with information. And I think the teachers are experiencing some of that themselves. And so what I've seen are some parents, you know, mostly middle-class parents, sort of coming together and kind of forming their own little sort of parental mutual aid groups, if you will, and information sessions, because the gaps are so large as far as what they're getting from the DOE. So I think that there's, again, that very little guidance is happening. And what I've even seen in my own household is an immense gap between all sorts of things. So between public and private, between traditional and charter schools. I mean, I have a son who is in, and you can't always compare it because one is high school and one is middle school. But I've heard anecdotally, this is the case elsewhere, where my middle school student, who is in one of the best quote unquote middle schools in District 15, you know, the learning that I can see is sparse. I don't think it's at the level of it was before. I don't think it's as disciplined. I don't think he's getting as much out of it. And I see my other son, who is in high school, who is in a private school, where there's a sense of rigor, and there's a sense of resource that is being made available to him that you just can't even compare the two. And I think that you're also seeing those divisions again among traditional and charter schools, and resources, whether we're talking about technical resources, whether we're talking about parental resources, whether we're talking about teacher and structural resources. This is where we see those inequities and where we see the shortfalls of the public systems really sort of rear their ugly head. And we've seen this across the board. And I really appreciate Emma talking in terms of intersectionality, because my organization works with tenants. We work with food, and we're seeing these inequities spill into the educational system. So you've got parents who are food insecure, who don't have jobs, who are, wondering about whether next time they're going to pay their rent, whether they have childcare issues that they never imagined having before, and having to contend with all of this without many of the again supports that other kinds of institutions and other kinds of social standing would afford you. So that's what I'm seeing. And I see parents are desperate. They don't have the information. They don't know what's happening ahead of them. And they feel as though, if you were suffering from these inequities before, they're looking towards the future and it's like, what is that going to mean as far as admissions? What does that mean in terms of my child being able to hold their own with other children in other privileged settings going forward? So that's what I'm seeing on the ground.
Thank you. And Emma, I guess both, in your school community at Elro, but also what you're seeing in dialogue with other IntegrateNYC leaders at, schools really all across the city.
Yeah, I think that so many of the existing educational inequities are just being exacerbated. And, we're often discussing in all sorts of issues, like why did it take a pandemic? Why did it take a pandemic for us to have soap in our bathrooms at schools, or for teachers to be checking up on their students when they don't show up to class for multiple days and things like that? And so I think all of these existing inequities are just being elevated and exacerbated. And I think that for a lot of student leaders, it's quite frustrating because these are issues that we've been talking about and organizing around for so long. And now people are suffering because no one listened or acted on it. And I think that, we're doing all of this remote learning from home. And so now it's not only an education issue, but it's an issue of housing, it's an issue of class. Again, all of these issues are intersecting, and there's such an extreme lack of support, and it's so clear what demographics are suffering the most. And from an in-school perspective, I think it's quite interesting because definitely each school's individual culture is definitely seeping into how they handle remote learning. And so again, like highlighting those 5 R's where, my school is very well resourced and we're ranked high in test scores and things like that, but we really lack school community and strong relationships between our students and our faculty and our teachers. So that's really seeping into our experience in remote learning, where we're really well resourced, but we're not going to school. So we're not really, using those resources or facilities. And now all that we have is the relationships that we have and being able to build on that. And those are the things that we lack. And so definitely every school's culture is being reflected in how they facilitate their remote learning and how they create their school schedule. And how much teacher and student involvement is part of that, where for me, I have to take every single class 4 days a week, but only for 20 minutes, right? So I have school from 9 to 12, 9 periods for 20 minutes, but no teacher can give you any formal instruction. 20 minutes takes 5 minutes for everyone to get there, and so if students and teachers were part of making that schedule, it would not look like that. While at other schools, they have a lot more comprehensive and kind of logical schedules because there was more student and teacher involvement in creating that. And I think that kind of same idea can be applied to, the creation of all other policy.
Can I just add one thing? A lot of this reminds me of, I'm old enough to remember the financial crisis in the mid-'70s in New York City, and how everything was reduced to its bare minimum. And what my fear is and what I'm seeing is that we're going to feel like we can only take care of very basic things, right? So even conversations around, we're talking about diversity and integration, you know, there were working groups that were established, diversity working groups that were established in the city. And I happen to be on one of them here in District 16. Those have been suspended indefinitely. I don't know if we're ever going to come back to those conversations. I don't know if we're going to feel like we have the luxury to come back to the conversations. I don't think we're going to have the money to come back to those conversations. And so much of what was potential in terms of progress, and so many of the ways we thought of education in expansive terms, I think all of that, I fear we're going to lose that.
I want to come back to that, both to ask Emma about this group she was on that made some recommendations about how to do admissions, and to talk a little bit about the District 15 work. But before that, there's two questions in the Q&A that I think relate to a couple of things you just said. Christina Berger says, you know, good or bad, charter networks like Success, Achievement First, KIPP, and Uncommon Schools, and some independent charters were, for the most part, able to pivot and maintain focus and rigor in this online world, while a lot of traditional schools were not. And Brian Moore asks, I think, a related question about magnet schools. And I just wonder, you know, yeah, well, I mean, do you think there's something, do you agree with that? And do you think there's something to learn there about, you know, what we're looking for in our schools?
Is that for me or for Emma?
Either. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I pointed to it before. I don't have a child in the charter schools right now, but I've been reading, I've been seeing what's been happening. And again, it's the point that Emma brought up before, that these inequities are only being exacerbated. And if you had the resources before, you have the resources now, and you're able to leverage them in a way that's going to help you survive and maintain that advantage. You know, as much as I am a champion of traditional public schools and will ride and die for them, this is exactly these kinds of things. Why particularly parents of color, Black parents who are oftentimes targeted for charter school recruitment, this is why they end up at charter schools, because they have been so let down by the public school system for such a long time. They don't, you know, we talk about choice, but they don't think of it in terms of choice. They think of it in terms of survival. And so it pains me that we're in this position right now. And it really is we really have to, and I think this is a moment for us to collect information from what we're seeing and to promise to do better going forward.
And I'm just going to weigh in here to say, like, as both a parent so my daughter is at Bard High School in Manhattan, you know, one of the screened public high schools. And then I represent District 15 elementary schools, which are full of upper middle class, mostly white kids. And I got to tell you, there's like some really great remote learning going on. Like, I was talking to a parent at PS 154 in Windsor Terrace yesterday, who just said, like, the whole school community has been able to show up and, like, not just deliver good remote learning, but be a mutual aid network for those people who need it. So, you know, I think this is, my sense is this is more about a combination of resources and the factors that help school communities cohere. Leadership that's well aligned with teachers and with families, and then has the resources and can deliver, you know, and where that is the case, those schools have been able to make this transition. And I think that is in the public system as well. It's just in the pieces of the public system that have a lot more resources, and families with a lot more resources. So,
right.
All right, so let me ask you about starting to move forward, because I'm hoping, I mean, I think, Mark, your point about all the ways in which this is going to set us backward on a set of conversations we were having, I think are very real. But I know that some of the folks at Integrate are trying to make sure we don't let that happen. And of course, we have this kind of interesting challenge at the moment around admissions, because in many of our middle schools and our high schools, you know, at the elementary school level, our segregation in schools is mostly a function of housing and residential segregation. We got, you know, zoned schools, and so they reproduce segregation in the city. But our middle and high schools, mostly are segregated through different screening policies. And what those mostly have relied on is how kids did in the second semester of their 4th grade year and 7th grade year, which is like an odd way to sort kids in the world, you know, like the idea that like 4th graders' second semester in their elementary school should determine their life chances is kind of galling, and it shouldn't take a pandemic to make you see that. But that's how we've done it. But now the second semester of these kids, 4th grades and 7th grades, are really not meaningful. And so there's an open conversation. What should we do next year about middle and high school admissions? And I know, Emma, you were on a working group that put some recommendations together. I wonder if you could talk a little about what those are.
Yeah, so I think like you all have highlighted, this moment is really elevating and exacerbating so many issues. And so we hope that we can utilize it in a way to garner support, but not just through the lens of COVID, garner long-term support for certain issues and policies. And we hope that, you know, the policies that come up during this time are not going to just be responsive to COVID-19, but will be kind of more sustainable and long-term and ambitious than the kind of policies that we wish we already had in place to have made this crisis a lot less extreme. And so we are calling for an end to all middle school screens. You know, we think that we should not be judging the worth and potential of 9-year-olds. And then for high school, we are calling for the end of all exclusionary screens, but we are not calling for an immediate end to all high school screens, because just as segregation was intentional, we think that integration needs to also be intentional, and that it's more than just moving bodies. And so we need to have inclusionary measures in replace of those exclusionary measures. So we think that, especially since things are moving so fast, we need really intentional and thoughtful policies to be put in place, rather than just a complete elimination of all screens, because that will also create opportunity for individual schools to kind of create their own ambiguous screening processes or admission processes. And we want to make sure that we create something more standardized and long-term. So yeah, and I also think that, you know, right now we really want to utilize this moment to highlight some of these screening measures that are no longer being used because of COVID-19. Admissions, for example, I don't think that admissions should have ever been part of the screening process. You know, now, or attendance, I mean. So like right now, we can't be taking attendance. But when we were going to school in person, attendance was already being measured in such kind of ambiguous and non-standardized ways, where, you know, it depended on the school, it depended on the teacher you had for your first or second period, it depended on all of these things that were completely arbitrary. And then again, for students who are more marginalized, who might have siblings that they need to take care of, who have longer commutes, who have issues in their housing or transportation, were negatively impacted by the attendance scores. And so for the upcoming year, attendance is not being included in admissions. And so we hope that it won't be reinstated. You know, I think that right now, so many things that we've been pushing for, that decision makers have been calling radical, are now being put in place. And so we hope that people will start looking at all of these issues as more of a crisis, like we had considered it before.
And, can I just ask more about what kind of reception you get, not from our listeners, not from Brad Lander, but where you're talking into the system and what kind of response you're getting. That would really go for both of you, but for the students right now.
Yeah, I think that for students, because this is their future, and for parents, because this is their child's future, they are being very receptive to kind of more radical changes to the admissions process. But what we want to be very cognizant of is that it's not just in response to COVID, and that support will be more sustainable. And so we want to be really intentional in what kinds of narratives we build from the student perspective, that this is not just a COVID-19 issue, but this is an issue that existed before and that will exist after, and that the support that we're garnering now is in response to an injustice in our admissions process, not just because this is a crazy time and we need to take crazy measures.
And I'll send around, because I don't want to, we only have another minute or two, some of the stuff about the District 15 work that we did over the past few years. But in a community-led process over the last 5 years, we eliminated screens in the District 15 middle schools, those middle schools of Red Hook and Sunset Park and Park Slope. And so we still have very segregated elementary schools because we still have very segregated neighborhoods. But the middle schools, those 11 middle schools, which were segregated by our screens, after like a lot of work, we actually have a system that made them substantially more integrated than they were, like really a pretty radical change. And it was a lot of hard work and organizing, and then like a lot of breath, people holding their breath, but it kind of is working. And I think because of both that evidence and the work that went behind it, but also just the fact that now we have to decide what to do for middle schools across the city, that possibility that we could for next year suspend screens for the vast majority of all New York City middle schools is a genuine possibility. And there's a lot of pushback against it because of a sense, and some of this is what Mark spoke to, like a sense of scarcity, and people are trying to hold on to the places that they feel like they know are working. But it's a pretty powerful and interesting conversation that, when you're forced to step back and say, is really sorting our 10-year-olds by how well they did, with their attendance and their test scores in the second semester of their fourth grade, really what we aspire to in an education system? And if not, what would it mean to deliver something different? And that doesn't answer the question, because, you can abandon admission screens and still not deliver high quality education to all those kids. But it at least makes you ask the questions in different ways. And I think, Emma, your point that like, the crisis is on the one hand, the platform that's kind of like pulling the rug out from under, but it only if you bring these values-based set of perspectives that you guys have been doing so much organizing around, could you get answers out of it that actually carried you forward in a better way. Ruth, anything to close here? We didn't get to all the questions in the chat.
We didn't get to all the questions in the chat. I mean, I think it's just what we said at the beginning. There's so much more to do, and so much need for people to be engaged behind these solutions and to here are the arguments against them, which is sometimes what's needed to really hear the debate out. But it's encouraging to me that you and that everybody thinks that we have sort of a forced experiment, because sometimes, Emma, I thought you said it very well, some things they can't do. But the question is how many of the recommendations that you're making, that Emma's making, that Mark is talking to, that you're picking up on, we can actually at least launch an experiment with some serious parameters. And it's hard to move the Board of Ed. And most of the questions were like, how do you move the Board of Ed? That would be a summary of most of the questions.
Really would. All right, you guys each want a last word before we close out?
Go for it, Emma.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me and kind of creating this platform for me. I sent a message in the chat with some ugly typos, but we, IntegrateNYC has launched a youth aid fund, which is fundraising money to give direct grants to students and their families. So it goes directly from you to the student, that covers costs in 3 major areas, focusing on mental health and medical care, groceries, and then phone, Wi-Fi bills relating to access to technology. And so in just a little over a week, we've actually raised over $10,000. And we've gotten loads of applications from students around the city. And we can't provide every single applicant with the money that they need. And so we're still fundraising. So I sent the link to donate in the chat.
Good.
Yeah,
Mark?
I'll just say that 2 things. One is, check out the Central Brooklyn Food Co-op and the Brooklyn Movement Center. Like I said, we do organizing around a broad cross-section of issues. And we're doing emergency food work in this moment to address food insecurity that the food co-op is really trying to attack on a long-term basis. And we're raising money for that as well. I also say that, on the school colors tip, we actually we're looking at possibly doing a season 2. That's imperiled a little bit right now because the idea was to focus on, to look at 3 of the experiments of the diversity working groups, to look at those processes and what was going on in those neighborhoods in the Bronx, in Staten Island, and in Queens. And there's a big question mark again about what's going to happen there. So, stay tuned for that as well.
That's great. And I'll just underline, I mean, Brooklyn Movement Center and IntegrateNYC are just 2 groups doing some of the most powerful kind of visionary racial justice and both Black-led on the one hand and student-led on the other organizing. So please support them. You'll like the emails you get in your inbox from both of them. They're, they're hard, but they're very hopeful. And definitely listen to School Colors season 1 if you haven't. You don't have to. You'll then want season 2, but you'll get a lot. If you enjoyed this conversation, you really will learn from that. So, Emma and Mark, thank you guys so much for all the organizing work and then for taking the time to be here with us. We really,
Thank you. And it's great to meet you, Ruth.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.